When a desperate woman steals a fortune and runs from a railroad empire, she finds herself trapped in a frozen mountain town with nowhere left to hide. A lone mountain man watches her board a wagon headed straight into a killer storm and makes a choice that will ignite a battle for survival, expose corruption that reaches the highest levels of power, and change both their lives forever. Stay with me until the very end of this story. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from so I can see how far this tale has traveled. Now, let me take you back to the winter of iron and snow. The wind off the mountains carried the smell of iron and coal smoke, a bitter promise that winter had arrived in Iron Hollow with teeth bared and claws extended. Silas Boone had lived through 43 winters in the high country, and he knew the language of the wind better than he knew the voices of men. This particular gust, howling down through the railroad cut and rattling the false front buildings along Main Street, spoke of a storm that would bury the passes and lock the world away for weeks. He didn't mind. Storms meant solitude, and solitude was the only companion he'd trusted in 15 years. Silas stood outside McCready's general store, a canvas pack slung over one massive shoulder, watching the street with eyes the color of creek ice. He was a tall man, broad through the chest and shoulders, with a beard gone silver at the edges and hands scarred from a lifetime of hard work in harder places. His buckskin coat bore patches of elk hide, and his boots were wrapped with rabbit fur against the cold. Everything about him said wilderness. He belonged to the peaks and pines, not to civilization's shabby approximation of order. The town itself was barely worth the name. Iron Hollow existed for one reason: the railroad. The Union Pacific had punched through here 6 years back, and now the town served as a waypoint for logging operations that stripped the forest bare and shipped the timber east to build cities Silas would never see and had no desire to visit. There was a rail station, a freight depot, a store, a telegraph office, a saloon, and a scattering of rough buildings that housed the workers who kept the operation running. One road in, one road out. A place people passed through, not a place they stayed. Perfect for a man who wanted nothing from the world. Silas had come down from his cabin with a simple plan: trade his furs for salt, flour, coffee, ammunition, and lamp oil, then disappear back into the high country before the storm hit. He'd already made his trade with McCready, a weasel-faced man who drove hard bargains but kept his word. The supplies were packed. His horse, a rangy Appaloosa gelding named Flint, was tied outside. Another hour, and he'd be gone. That was when he saw her. She stood outside the stage depot, a figure that stopped him cold, not because she was beautiful, though she was, but because she was wrong. Everything about her screamed Eastern money in a place where money came covered in sawdust and coal dust. Her coat was fine wool, deep blue with velvet trim, cut in a style that belonged in Philadelphia or Boston, not a Wyoming rail town where the temperature hadn't climbed above freezing in 2 weeks. Her boots were leather, heeled and polished, utterly useless in snow. Her dark hair was pinned up beneath a small hat that might have looked fashionable in some city parlor, but here just looked absurd. But it was her face that held him. She was young, mid-20s, he guessed, with pale skin and dark eyes that swept the street with the sharp awareness of a cornered animal. Fear. He recognized it instantly, the way a hunter recognizes the scent of blood. She was afraid and trying hard not to show it. Silas felt something shift in his chest, an old instinct he thought he'd buried. Not your problem, not your concern. He turned toward Flint, ready to mount up and leave. But then the woman's carpet bag slipped from her gloved hands and hit the frozen mud with a heavy thud. The latch popped. Contents spilled across the ground. Silas saw it all in the 3 seconds before she dropped to her knees and frantically began scooping things back into the bag: clothing, a hairbrush, a small leather journal, and a thick bundle of cash bound with string, bills and denominations that made his eyes narrow. Hundreds. More money than most men in Iron Hollow would see in 5 years. She grabbed the money with shaking hands, stuffed it deep into the bag, and snapped the latch shut. When she looked up, her eyes locked with his across 20 feet of frozen street. For a moment, neither moved. Her face went pale, and he saw the calculation flash across her features. How much did he see? What will he do? Silas broke the gaze first. He turned back to Flint, checked the saddle girth, and began tying down his pack. Behind him, he heard her footsteps, quick, uneven on the ice, heading toward the depot. Not your problem. But his hand stilled on the rope. He'd seen that kind of fear before. In the eyes of a doe he'd once found caught in a deadfall, leg broken, waiting for the wolves. He'd ended her suffering with a clean shot because that was the merciful thing to do. But this woman wasn't caught yet. She was still running. From what? From whom? The depot door slammed. Silas finished securing his pack, then walked across the street. The stage depot was barely warmer than outside. A pot-bellied stove in the corner put out more smoke than heat, and the wooden benches along the wall were scarred with initials and crude drawings. Behind a barred window sat Horace Finch, the depot manager, a thin man with spectacles and the permanent scowl of someone who'd given up on life delivering anything better than what he already had. The woman stood at the window, her back rigid. "I need a ticket on the next westbound stage." Finch didn't even look up from his ledger. "Stages don't run when there's a blizzard coming," which there is. "Won't be another coach through for at least a week, maybe 2. "That's unacceptable. I'll pay double the fare." "Triple the fare won't change the weather, miss. Stage stops running, that's the end of it." Finch finally looked up, his eyes narrowing as he took in her expensive coat and desperate expression. "You could try the freight depot. Sometimes they'll let passengers ride in the caboose if the price is right, and the engineer's feeling generous, but the next freight isn't until tomorrow morning, and I wouldn't count on it leaving if this storm's as bad as they're saying." The woman's jaw tightened. "Then I'll wait for the freight." Finch shrugged. "Suit yourself. But there's no accommodations in Iron Hollow beyond the saloon, and that's no place for a lady. You got anywhere to stay?" She didn't answer. She turned sharply and nearly collided with Silas, who'd been standing just inside the door. "Excuse me," she said, the words clipped and cold. She tried to step around him, but he moved, not blocking her exactly, but not making it easy. "You running from the law?" Silas asked, his voice quiet. Her eyes flashed. "That's none of your business." "Didn't say it was, but a town with one road in and one road out is a poor place to hide." He glanced at the bag clutched tight against her side. "Especially when you're carrying enough cash to make folks curious." Color flooded her cheeks. Anger, not embarrassment. "I don't recall asking for your advice, Mr. Boone." "And you didn't, but you're going to get it anyway." He nodded toward the window, where the sky was darkening to the color of old lead. "Storm's coming. Big one. You try to leave town in this, you won't make it 5 miles. You stay here, you're trapped. Either way, if someone's looking for you, they'll find you." "Then what?" she said, her voice sharp with barely controlled panic. "Do you suggest I do?" Silas met her gaze. For a moment he considered telling her the truth. "Nothing. There's nothing you can do. You're caught, and you might as well accept it." But something in her eyes, a fierce, stubborn refusal to surrender, reminded him of someone he'd lost a long time ago. "Don't know," he said finally. "But spending the night in that saloon will get you noticed by every drifter, rail worker, and drunk in 50 miles. You want to stay invisible, that's the wrong move." She studied him, suspicion and desperation warring in her expression. "Why do you care?" Good question. He didn't have a good answer. "Don't particularly," he said. "But I've seen what happens to people who make bad choices in the high country. Most of them don't get a second chance." For a moment he thought she might thank him, or tell him to go to hell. Instead, she did something unexpected. She held out her hand. "Evelyn Harrow," she said. He looked at her hand for a beat, then shook it once. Her grip was firm despite the gloves, and her palm was cold. "Miss Harrow," he said, touching the brim of his hat. Then he turned and walked out into the wind. Silas spent the next hour at the saloon not drinking. He hadn't touched whiskey in 12 years, but listening. The Iron Hollow Saloon was the kind of place where information flowed more freely than the liquor, and if someone was asking about a woman matching Evelyn Harrow's description, he'd hear about it here. The saloon was packed. Rail workers fresh off shift, loggers down from the camps, drifters waiting out the weather, all of them crowded around tables slick with spilled beer, shouting over the clank of the piano in the corner. The air was thick with smoke and sweat and the stink of unwashed men. Silas took a seat at the bar, ordered coffee, and let the noise wash over him. "Heard the passes are already closed up north." "Don't matter. Freight'll get through. Always does." said there was a woman at the depot dressed like she stepped out of a goddamn catalog. Silas's attention sharpened. The speaker was a logger named Brennan, a loudmouthed Irishman with a red beard and a reputation for meanness when he drank. He sat with two other men at a corner table, laughing too hard at his own joke. "Saw her myself," Brennan said, sloshing beer as he gestured. "Fine piece of work she was. All alone, too. I'm thinking maybe she's looking for company." "You're thinking with the wrong head," one of his companions said, but he was grinning. "Aye, maybe. But a woman like that don't come to Iron Hollow unless she's desperate or stupid. Either way, I'd be happy to offer my assistance." More laughter. Silas's jaw tightened. He stood, dropped a coin on the bar, and headed for the door. Behind him, Brennan's voice rose again. "Hell, maybe I'll go offer my services right now." Silas pushed out into the cold and stopped. The wind had picked up, and the first flakes of snow were starting to fall. Small, hard flakes that stung like thrown sand. The sky was the color of old iron. The storm was here. He looked toward the depot, then toward the edge of town where the road climbed into the logging trails. A flicker of movement caught his eye. A wagon. Two-horse team, pulling a flatbed loaded with canvas-wrapped supplies. The driver was hunched against the wind, and beside him, Silas's breath caught. Evelyn Harrow sat on the wagon bench, her blue coat stark against the gray landscape. Even from a distance, he could see the tension in her posture, the way she gripped the edge of the seat. The driver was Billy Crofton, a known drunk and a fool who'd once tried to take a wagon through a spring thaw and lost half his cargo in a ravine. Silas had pulled him out of a snowbank 2 winters back and regretted it ever since. The wagon turned north toward the logging trails. Silas stood frozen, watching them disappear into the swirling snow. The logging trails were a maze of half-cut roads that wound through the foothills, dangerous in good weather and deadly in a storm. Crofton was probably hauling supplies to one of the remote camps, and Evelyn had likely paid him to take her as far as the next town. She'd be dead before morning. Not your problem. Silas turned toward Flint. He should leave. Ride south. Drop into the lower valleys where the storm wouldn't hit as hard, then circle back to his cabin once it passed. Evelyn Harrow had made her choice. If she wanted to trust a drunk to guide her through a blizzard, that was on her. He swung into the saddle. Flint shifted beneath him, ears flicking toward the north road. Silas sat there, snow beginning to accumulate on his shoulders, and thought about the woman in the wagon, about the fear in her eyes, about the money in her bag and the fact that she'd rather risk death in a storm than stay another night in Iron Hollow. He thought about another woman 15 years ago who'd needed help and hadn't gotten it in time. "God damn it," he said softly. He turned Flint north and rode into the storm. The wind hit like a fist the moment he left the shelter of the town. Snow came horizontal, blinding and brutal, turning the world into a whiteout chaos of ice and noise. Silas pulled his scarf up over his nose and leaned low over Flint's neck, trusting the horse to find the trail. Tracks were already filling in. He followed the twin ruts left by Crofton's wagon, but within minutes they were barely visible. The temperature was dropping fast, and the wind carried the deep, bone-shaking cold that killed men in their sleep. He rode for what felt like hours, but was probably less than one, climbing into the foothills where the pines grew thick and the trail narrowed to a single track. The wagon would have to slow here. If he pushed, he could catch them, if they hadn't already gone off the road. Flint's hooves slipped on ice. Silas pulled him back, patted his neck. "Easy, boy, easy." The trail curved around a rock outcrop, and suddenly the wagon was there, overturned, one wheel spinning lazily in the wind. The horses were gone, either cut loose or run off. Canvas and supplies were scattered across the snow, and Evelyn Harrow was trapped beneath it. Silas was off Flint and running before he fully processed what he was seeing. She was on her side, pinned under the wagon bed, her face bone white and her lips blue. Her eyes were open but glassy, and she didn't react when he dropped to his knees beside her. "Miss Harrow, Evelyn." No response. He put a hand against her neck. Pulse, faint, but there. She was alive, but hypothermia was setting in fast. Silas looked around. No sign of Crofton. The bastard had cut the horses loose and left her to die. He grabbed the wagon bed and heaved. It was heavy, loaded with supplies, and the angle was wrong. He shifted, planted his boots, and lifted with everything he had. The wagon rose an inch, 2 inches, just enough. "Move," he growled. Not sure if she could even hear him. She didn't move. Silas wedged his shoulder under the wagon and pulled her free with one arm, dragging her clear just as his strength gave out and the wagon crashed back down. She was limp in his arms, her breathing shallow. He had minutes, not hours. He carried her to Flint, wrapped her in his own coat, and lifted her onto the saddle. Then he climbed up behind her, pulled her against his chest, and turned the horse back toward the trail. Not to town, that was too far, and she wouldn't survive the ride. To his cabin, 2 miles west, tucked into a valley where the wind wouldn't be as brutal. 2 miles, in a blizzard, carrying a woman who might already be dying. Silas spurred Flint forward and rode into the teeth of the storm. Go. The cabin appeared out of the snow like a ghost, a low structure of chinked logs with a sod roof and a stone chimney. Silas had built it with his own hands 15 years ago, after he'd left everything behind and come to the high country to disappear. It wasn't much. 1 room, a stone fireplace, a sleeping loft, but it was solid, and it was shelter. He half carried, half dragged Evelyn inside, kicked the door shut behind them, and laid her on the floor near the cold fireplace. Her skin was ice cold, her breathing so shallow he had to put his ear to her mouth to confirm she was still alive. He worked fast, built a fire, hands moving on instinct even as his mind screamed that it was too late. She was too far gone. Got the flames roaring, then stripped off her wet coat, her boots, her dress. No time for modesty, not when every second counted. Wrapped her in blankets and furs, then laid her as close to the fire as he dared. For the next hour, he did everything he knew how to do. Warmed stones in the fire and wrapped them in cloth, tucking them against her feet and hands. Heated broth and tried to get a few spoonfuls past her blue lips. Rubbed her arms and legs to get the blood moving. And he talked. Didn't know why, didn't know if she could hear him, but he talked anyway. "You're going to be fine. You hear me? You're going to make it. You're tougher than you look, I can tell. You didn't come this far to die in some mountain cabin, so you keep breathing, you keep fighting." He didn't mention the woman he'd said the same words to once, years ago, before she'd slipped away despite everything he'd tried. Outside, the storm howled. Inside, the fire crackled and hissed. And slowly, finally, Evelyn's breathing deepened. Color began to return to her face. Her eyelids fluttered. Silas sat back, exhaled hard, and let himself believe she might actually survive. But she woke near dawn. The storm still raged outside, but the cabin was warm, the fire burning low and steady. Silas sat in a chair near the window, watching the snow, when he heard her move. "Where?" Her voice was barely a whisper, hoarse and cracked. He turned. She was sitting up, wrapped in blankets, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. Her eyes were clear now, though shadowed with exhaustion. "My cabin," Silas said, "about 2 miles west of where I found you." She looked around, taking in the rough-hewn walls, the simple furnishings, the furs hanging from pegs. Then her gaze dropped to herself, to the blankets, the absence of her dress. Her cheeks flushed. "Did you—" "Saved your life," Silas said flatly. "You were half frozen. Another hour and you'd have been dead. I did what I had to do." She pulled the blankets tighter, but the anger in her eyes faded, replaced by something else. Shame, maybe, or gratitude. "The wagon driver," she said. "He left me." "I know. Why did you come after me?" Silas didn't have a good answer to that. He'd asked himself the same question a dozen times during the long night. "Seemed like the thing to do," he said finally. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment, and he had the unsettling sense that she was seeing more than he wanted her to see. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded, stood, and moved to the stove. "You should eat something. You've been out for hours." She didn't argue. He heated more broth, brought it to her in a tin cup. She drank slowly, her hands shaking but steady enough. "How long will the storm last?" she asked. 2 days, maybe 3, maybe longer. And we're trapped here." "Yes." She closed her eyes, and he saw the fear return. "They'll find me. When the storm clears, they'll come looking. Who? She hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. When she opened her eyes again, there was a new hardness there, a resolve. Men who want me dead, she said. Silas pulled the other chair over and sat across from her. Tell me. And after a long pause, she did. Evelyn Harrow's father had been a railroad contractor in Philadelphia, a man who'd built his reputation on integrity and hard work. But 3 years ago, he'd taken a job for the wrong people, a consortium of investors led by a man named Marcus Ashford, who owned half the Union Pacific and wanted to own the other half. My father didn't know what he was getting into, Evelyn said, her voice low and tight. Ashford promised him a fortune if he could secure land rights through a valley in Colorado where they wanted to build a new rail line. My father thought it was legitimate. He bought the land, moved the equipment, started laying track. She paused, staring into the fire. Then he found out the truth. Ashford had paid off territorial judges to seize the land illegally from the ranchers who actually owned it. Men lost their homes. Families were driven out. Some of them fought back, and Ashford sent hired guns to deal with them. My father tried to walk away, but by then he was too deep. Ashford told him if he didn't finish the job, he'd destroy him, ruin his name, take everything he had. So he finished it, Silas said. He had no choice, but it broke him. Last year, he had a stroke. The doctors said it was the stress. He's bedridden now, can't speak, can't work. And Ashford didn't care. He called in the debt anyway. $50,000 my father didn't have. Silas let out a low whistle. $50,000 was a fortune. Ashford offered me a solution, Evelyn continued, her voice hard. Marry him, and the debt would be forgiven. My father would be taken care of. I'd live in comfort for the rest of my life. And you said no. I said I'd rather burn in hell. Despite everything, Silas felt the corner of his mouth twitch. This woman had spine. So you ran. Not at first. I tried to fight him legally, but Ashford owns judges, politicians, police. There was no one I could turn to. Then one night, I found something. She reached for her carpet bag, which Silas had brought in and set by the fire. She opened it and pulled out the leather journal he'd seen earlier. My father kept records. Every land deal, every payoff, every piece of leverage Ashford used. Names, dates, amounts, enough to bring down the entire operation if it ever went public. Silas took the journal, flipped through it. Page after page of neat handwriting, columns of numbers, lists of names. Some of them he recognized, senators, businessmen, men who moved in circles of power so far above Iron Hollow they might as well have been on the moon. This is dangerous, Silas said. I know, that's why I took it, along with $15,000 in cash from my father's safe, money he'd been saving to pay Ashford back. Her jaw tightened. I figured if I could get far enough away, I could use the journal to negotiate, trade it for my father's freedom. But Ashford found out before I could leave Philadelphia. He sent men after me, bounty hunters, the kind who don't ask questions. How many? At least 3 that I know of, maybe more. Silas handed the journal back. And you thought Iron Hollow was a good place to hide? I thought it was remote enough that they wouldn't think to look here. I was wrong. You were desperate, Silas said. Not an accusation, just a fact. Evelyn nodded. She looked exhausted, the kind of bone-deep tired that came from running too long with no hope of safety. I don't know what to do anymore, she admitted, and for the first time he heard the cracks in her armor. I can't go back. I can't move forward. I'm trapped. Outside, the storm howled. Inside, the fire crackled. Silas stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the wall of white. Somewhere out there, men were hunting this woman. Men who would kill her without hesitation if it meant protecting the fortunes and reputations detailed in that journal. He thought about the life he'd built here, solitary, quiet, disconnected from the world and its endless cruelties. He'd come to the high country to escape, and for 15 years it had worked. But standing here, listening to Evelyn Harrow's story, he felt something shift, something old and buried, a part of himself he'd thought was dead. When the storm clears, he said, not turning around, we'll figure out a plan. Get you somewhere safe. Why would you help me? He didn't answer right away. Didn't know how to explain the weight of old debts and older guilt. Because you're here, he said finally, and you need help. It wasn't much of an answer, but it was all he had. Behind him, Evelyn Harrow was silent. When he finally turned around, she was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Gratitude, yes, but also something deeper. Recognition? Maybe. The look of one survivor seeing another. Thank you, she said again. Silas nodded once, then moved to bank the fire for the night. Outside, the storm swallowed the world in snow and darkness, and two strangers, bound now by circumstance and desperation, settled in to wait for the dawn. The storm didn't break on the third day as Silas had hoped. It intensified. Wind tore at the cabin walls with a fury that made the whole structure groan, and snow piled against the door until he had to dig them out twice a day just to keep from being buried alive. The world beyond the frosted window ceased to exist. There was only white, endless, and absolute, a void that swallowed sound and light, and any sense of time passing. Inside, the cabin became its own small universe. Silas kept the fire burning, rationed their supplies, and tried not to think about how long they might be trapped here, or what would happen when the snow finally stopped. Evelyn healed quickly. By the second day, the color had returned to her face, and by the third, she was moving around the cabin without his help, though she still wrapped herself in blankets against the cold that seeped through every crack in the walls. She didn't talk much at first, and Silas respected that. He understood the need for silence, for space to process fear and exhaustion. But on the fourth day, as the storm howled outside and they sat on opposite sides of the fire eating a sparse dinner of salt pork and beans, she broke the quiet. How long have you lived up here? Silas looked up from his plate. 15 years, give or take. Alone? Mostly. She studied him across the firelight, her dark eyes curious but cautious. That's a long time to be by yourself. It's a long time to be anywhere, he said, and went back to eating. She didn't press, and he was grateful for it. But later, as he cleaned the plates and she sat wrapped in furs near the fire, she spoke again. You said I reminded you of someone. When you found me. Silas's hand stilled in the wash bucket. He hadn't said that out loud, had he? But maybe she'd heard it in his voice, in the desperation with which he'd worked to save her. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. He dried the plates slowly, buying time, then set them on the rough wooden shelf he'd built years ago. When he turned back, she was still watching him, waiting. My wife, he said finally, the words coming hard. You remind me of her. Evelyn's expression softened. What happened to her? Silas walked to the window and looked out at the storm. The memories were old, worn smooth by time, but they still had edges sharp enough to cut. We had a homestead, down in the valley, near Fort Collins. Built it ourselves, worked the land, planned to raise a family. He paused, jaw tight. There was a drought. Lasted 3 years. Crops failed, livestock died. We borrowed money to keep going, kept thinking next season would be better. It wasn't. The debt, Evelyn said quietly. Banks sent men to collect. We didn't have it. They were going to take the land, the house, everything. He turned to face her. Sarah, my wife. She went to town to try to negotiate. Thought maybe she could convince them to give us more time. I should have gone with her, but I was too proud, too angry. I stayed home and drank myself stupid while she went alone. The silence stretched. Outside, the wind screamed. They found her 3 days later, Silas continued, his voice flat and hard. Thrown from her horse on the road back. Broke her neck in the fall. The bank said it was an accident, that the horse must have spooked. But I knew better. I knew the kind of men they'd sent, the kind who didn't like being told no by a woman. Evelyn's hand rose to her mouth. Silas, I went after them, he said, cutting her off. Found 2 of the 3. Beat them half to death before the sheriff pulled me off. Spent 6 months in jail. When I got out, everything was gone. The homestead, sold. Sarah, buried. Nothing left but debts and memories I didn't want. He moved back to his chair and sat heavily. So I came up here. Built this place. Decided the world and its cruelties could go to hell without me. Evelyn was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was soft but steady. I'm sorry. For what happened to her. For what they did to you. It was a long time ago. That doesn't make it hurt less. No, Silas thought, it didn't. They sat in silence after that, the fire crackling between them, each lost in their own ghosts. But somehow the silence felt different now, less like isolation and more like understanding. Two people who'd been broken by the world's indifference, trying to survive in the ruins. Finally, Evelyn spoke again. "Do you ever think about going back? To civilization, I mean." Silas shook his head. "Nothing there for me." "What about justice? For Sarah?" "Justice is a word rich men use when they want to feel righteous about protecting what's theirs," Silas said bitterly. "Doesn't mean anything to people like us." "It could," Evelyn said. "If we had proof, if we could expose the men who abuse their power." She was talking about the journal, Silas realized, about the names and numbers that could bring down Marcus Ashford and his consortium. "You really think that book will change anything?" he asked. "I have to believe it will," she said, "because if it won't, then everything I've done, running, stealing, putting my father at risk, all of it was for nothing." Silas heard the desperation in her voice and understood it. She needed to believe the fight mattered because the alternative was unbearable. "Maybe you're right," he said, though he didn't believe it. In his experience, powerful men always found a way to survive, and people like Evelyn and Sarah always paid the price. But he didn't say that. Instead, he stood, added another log to the fire, and changed the subject. "Storm should break tomorrow, maybe the day after. When it does, we'll need to move fast." Evelyn nodded, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Where will we go?" "Back to Iron Hollow first. We'll need supplies, and I need to check if anyone's been asking about you." "And if they have?" "Then we figure out another plan." It wasn't much of a strategy, but it was all he had. That night, Silas gave Evelyn the sleeping loft and bedded down near the fire. He lay awake long after she'd fallen asleep, listening to the storm and thinking about the choice he'd made when he rode after her into the blizzard. It would have been easier to let her go, to let fate take its course. But something in him, some stubborn, half-dead part he'd thought was buried with Sarah, had refused to let another woman die alone in the cold. Now she was his responsibility, whether he wanted it or not. And somewhere out there, men were hunting her. Silas closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but his hand rested on the rifle he kept within arm's reach, and his mind wouldn't quiet. Tomorrow the storm would break, and when it did, everything would change. He just didn't know how much. The storm finally died on the 5th morning. Silas woke to silence, absolute eerie silence after days of howling wind, and knew before he opened his eyes that it was over. He rose, dressed quickly in the cold cabin, and opened the door. The world had been remade in white. Snow lay 4 feet deep in places, sculpted by the wind into drifts that looked like frozen waves. The sky was a hard, brilliant blue, and the sun rising over the peaks turned the snow to fields of diamond fire. It was beautiful in the way that deadly things often are. Silas grabbed a shovel and started digging out the door. Behind him, he heard Evelyn stirring in the loft. "Is it over?" she called down. "For now." She climbed down and came to stand in the doorway, wrapped in one of his heavy coats that hung to her knees. She stared at the transformed landscape, and he saw something shift in her expression, wonder giving way to fear. "They'll come now," she said. "Maybe, but the passes will still be closed for days. That buys us time." "How much?" "Enough if we're smart about it," he hoped. They spent the morning preparing. Silas saddled Flint and loaded what supplies they could carry. Evelyn packed her carpet bag with the journal and the remaining cash, checking the latch 3 times to make sure it wouldn't come open. She'd found her dress dried and mended. Silas had worked on it while she slept, stitching the torn seams with practiced hands that remembered mending Sarah's clothes by firelight. And though it was wrinkled and stained, it was whole. "You didn't have to do that," she said, running her fingers over the repaired fabric. "Couldn't have you freezing on the ride back." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, then nodded. "Thank you." They left at noon, when the sun was highest and the trail most visible. The ride back was slow and treacherous. Flint had to pick his way through snowdrifts that sometimes rose above his knees, and more than once they had to dismount and lead him around deadfalls where the weight of snow had brought down whole trees. Evelyn rode behind Silas, her arms wrapped around his waist, and he tried not to think about the warmth of her against his back or the way she'd stopped shaking after the first mile. They didn't talk. The silence was necessary, practical. saving breath for the cold, conserving energy for the journey. But it was also comfortable in a way that surprised him. In 5 days, this woman had gone from a stranger to something else. Not quite a friend, he didn't let people get that close, but not a stranger anymore either. It took 3 hours to reach the overlook above Iron Hollow. Silas reined Flint to a stop and sat studying the town below. At first glance, everything looked normal. Smoke rose from chimneys. The rail yard was clear of snow, crews already working to restore the lines. People moved along the main street, small and dark against the white. But then Silas saw them. Horses tied outside the saloon, too many horses. And near the depot, 2 men in long coats and wide-brimmed hats standing in a way that suggested they were watching rather than waiting. "What is it?" Evelyn whispered. "Company," Silas said grimly. "The kind you don't want." He counted. At least 6 horses at the saloon, maybe more. The 2 men at the depot. Others he couldn't see but knew would be there, watching the roads, asking questions, waiting. "They're here for me," Evelyn said, and it wasn't a question. "Looks that way." She was quiet for a moment, then, "What do we do?" Silas considered. Riding into town was suicide. But they needed supplies, and more importantly, they needed information. Who were these men? How many? Were they just bounty hunters, or had Ashford sent something worse? "There's someone in town who might help," Silas said. "Man named Thomas Greer. Runs the blacksmith shop. He's not friendly, but he's honest, and he owes me a favor." "You trust him?" "As much as I trust anyone." Which wasn't saying much, but it would have to do. Silas turned Flint west away from the main road and began the descent through the trees. If they were careful, they could approach the smithy from the back, where the alleys and outbuildings would provide cover. It took another hour of slow, careful movement, but eventually they reached the edge of town. Silas left Flint tied in a stand of pines and led Evelyn on foot through the narrow spaces between buildings. The snow here was trampled and dirty, marked with boot prints and wagon tracks. Voices drifted from the saloon, rough laughter, the clink of bottles. The smithy sat at the far end of town, a low building with a forged chimney that poured smoke into the clear sky. Silas approached from the rear, where stacks of iron stock and broken equipment created a maze of shadows. The back door was unlocked. He pushed it open and slipped inside, Evelyn close behind. Thomas Greer stood at his anvil, hammer raised, about to strike a glowing piece of metal. He was a massive man, broad-shouldered and thick-armed, with skin darkened by soot and a beard shot through with gray. When he saw Silas, he froze, hammer still raised. "Boone," he said, his voice like gravel shifting. "Heard you were dead." "Not yet." Greer's eyes shifted to Evelyn, and something flickered across his face. Recognition or suspicion, Silas couldn't tell which. "She's the one they're looking for," Greer said. "I know." "Then you're a fool for bringing her here." "Probably. But I need information, Thomas. And you owe me." Greer scowled, set down his hammer, and wiped his hands on his leather apron. 3 years ago, I pulled you out of a snowbank. Debts paid. 2 years ago, you shot a man who tried to rob your shop. I buried the body and never said a word. Debt's not even close to paid." The 2 men stared at each other. Finally, Greer spat into the forge and nodded. "What do you want to know?" "Who are they, the men looking for her?" "Bounty hunters, mostly, led by a man calls himself Cade. Tall, thin, wears a black duster. Mean as a snake and twice as quick. He's got 5 men with him, maybe 6. Been here 2 days asking about a woman matching her description." "What did you tell them?" "Nothing. I don't talk to men like that." Greer looked at Evelyn. "But others did. They know she was here. They know about the wagon that left during the storm. Found Billy Crofton half frozen in a drift yesterday, babbling about leaving a woman to die in the mountains." Evelyn's face went pale. "They know where I was." "They know you probably died out there," Greer corrected. "But Cade's not convinced. He's waiting to see if you turn up." "How long will he wait?" Silas asked. "As long as it takes. Men like him don't quit." Silas felt a cold weight settle in his chest. They couldn't hide in the mountains forever, and they couldn't outrun professional hunters indefinitely. What about the westbound freight? He asked. When's the next one through? Tomorrow morning, early, 6 o'clock. Greer's eyes narrowed. You thinking of putting her on it? If I can. You can't. Cade's got men watching the depot round the clock. She shows her face, they'll take her. Then we don't let them see her face. Greer was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he shook his head. You're going to get yourself killed, Boone. Wouldn't be the first time I tried. Despite everything, Greer's mouth twitched, almost a smile. What do you need from me? A distraction. Something big enough to pull their attention away from the depot, long enough for us to get her on that train. That's a tall order. I know. Greer looked at Evelyn again, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed, a sound like a forge bellows deflating. There's a load of timber being shipped out tomorrow. Big one, headed for Denver. I'm supposed to inspect the chains before they load it. If something were to go wrong during the loading, chains breaking, maybe a wagon tipping, it would cause quite a scene. Tie up the rail yard for hours. Can you make that happen? I can make anything happen in this town, Boone. Question is, will it be enough? Silas didn't have an answer to that, but it was better than nothing. Tomorrow then, he said, just after dawn. Greer nodded. Where will you be until then? Somewhere they won't think to look. That'll be a neat trick in a town this size. It would. But Silas had spent 15 years learning the land around Iron Hollow, learning every cave and canyon and hidden hollow. He'd find a place. They left through the back door and made their way carefully through the alleys. Silas was hyper-aware of every sound, every movement. Once footsteps approached from around a corner and he pulled Evelyn into the shadows behind a woodpile, his hand over her mouth, until the steps passed. Her heart hammered against his palm, and he felt an unexpected surge of protectiveness so fierce it startled him. When they reached Flint, Silas helped her into the saddle and swung up behind her. He didn't head back into the high country, too obvious, and the trails would be watched. Instead, he turned south, toward the river canyon where old mining camps sat abandoned and forgotten. It was full dark by the time they reached the camp Silas had in mind. It wasn't much, a collapsed cabin and a few rotting outbuildings, but there was a root cellar still intact, dug deep into the hillside and lined with stone. It would be cold, but it would be shelter, and more importantly, it would be invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. Silas cleared the entrance and helped Evelyn down into the darkness. He'd brought candles and matches, and once he got a light going, the small space revealed itself. Stone walls, dirt floor, old shelving that had once held preserves and potatoes. Not comfortable, but safe. We'll stay here until morning, he said. Then we move. Evelyn nodded. She looked exhausted, her face drawn and pale in the candlelight. But there was also something else in her expression, determination, maybe, or resignation. The look of someone who'd accepted that tomorrow might be the end, one way or another. Silas, she said quietly. Yeah? If something goes wrong tomorrow, if they catch us, I want you to know I'm grateful for everything you've done. Nothing's going to go wrong. But if it does, it won't. She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. But she didn't look convinced, and truthfully, neither was he. They shared what little food he'd brought, jerky and hardtack washed down with water from his canteen. Then Evelyn curled up in the corner with the blankets he'd packed, and Silas sat near the entrance, rifle across his knees, listening to the night. Hours passed. The candle burned low. Evelyn's breathing evened out into sleep, and Silas was left alone with his thoughts. He thought about Sarah, about the choices that had led to her death and his long exile. He thought about the men hunting Evelyn and the journal in her bag that could destroy them. He thought about Thomas Greer's warning. You're going to get yourself killed, Boone. Maybe. But if he was going to die, at least it would be for something that mattered, for someone who deserved better than what the world had given her. The candle flickered and died. In the darkness, Silas closed his eyes and waited for dawn. When the first light of morning crept through the cracks in the cellar door, Silas woke Evelyn with a gentle hand on her shoulder. She came awake instantly, eyes wide and alert. No confusion, no hesitation. She'd learned to sleep like a hunted thing, ready to run at a moment's notice. It's time, he said. They gathered their things in silence and climbed out of the cellar into a world painted gold and pink by the rising sun. The air was brutally cold, their breath rising in clouds, but the sky was clear. Good weather for travel, bad weather for hiding. Silas helped Evelyn onto Flint, then led the horse on foot through the canyon. They couldn't risk being seen on the road, so he took them through the trees, following a deer trail that wound parallel to the rail line. By the time they reached the outskirts of Iron Hollow, the sun was fully up and the town was stirring. Silas found a vantage point in the rocks above the rail yard and settled in to watch. Right on schedule, a crew of workers began loading the timber shipment, massive logs chained to flatbed cars. Thomas Greer was there, moving between the cars, inspecting the chains with deliberate slowness. Silas spotted Cade and his men near the depot, exactly where Greer had said they'd be, waiting, watching. Everything was in place. Now it was just a matter of timing. Silas felt Evelyn's hand slip into his, and he realized she was shaking, not from cold, from fear. "When this starts," he said quietly, not looking at her, "you run. Don't look back. Don't wait for me. You get on that train and you go." "What about you?" "I'll be right behind you." "Silas, I mean it, Evelyn. You get on that train." She was quiet for a moment, then squeezed his hand once before letting go. Below, Thomas Greer stepped back from one of the flatbed cars and raised his arm. The signal. Then everything went to hell. The chain securing the top tier of logs snapped with a sound like a gunshot. Logs rolled, crashing down onto the rail bed with earth-shaking force. Men shouted, dove out of the way. One log smashed into a water tower, rupturing it, sending a flood of icy water across the yard. Chaos erupted. Workers ran. Foremen bellowed orders, and Cade and his men turned as one, drawn by the commotion. "Now," Silas said. They ran. Down the slope they went, half running, half sliding through the snow that still clung to the shadowed places between rocks. Silas kept Evelyn's hand gripped tight in his, pulling her forward when she stumbled, steadying her when loose stones shifted beneath her impractical boots. Behind them, the sounds of chaos in the rail yard grew louder. Men shouting, the crash of more timber falling, the shriek of metal on metal. Thomas Greer had done his job well. Maybe too well. They reached the backside of the freight depot just as the westbound locomotive began venting steam, preparing for departure. Silas pressed Evelyn against the wall and peered around the corner. The platform was mostly clear. The commotion at the loading area had drawn nearly everyone away. But not everyone. A man stood near the passenger entrance, arms crossed, watching the chaos with the detached interest of someone who'd seen it all before. He wore a black duster that hung to his knees, and even from this distance, Silas could see the twin revolvers holstered at his hips. Cade. Had to be. "Stay here," Silas whispered to Evelyn. "What are you going to do?" "Getting us on that train." He started to move, but her hand shot out and caught his arm. "Silas, he'll kill you." "Not if I'm careful." "You can't fight all of them alone." Silas looked down at her hand on his arm, then met her eyes. Fear blazed there, but also something fiercer, determination maybe, or the stubborn refusal to let someone else die for her sake. It reminded him so much of Sarah in those last days before she rode to town that his chest tightened. "I'm not fighting anyone if I can help it," he said quietly. "Just trust me." She held his gaze a moment longer, then released him. "Be careful." He moved along the depot wall, keeping low, using the stacked crates and equipment as cover. The locomotive was building pressure, steam hissing from the release valves in white plumes that caught the morning sun. The freight cars stretched behind it, boxcars, flatbeds, and at the very end, the caboose. That was their target. The caboose door faced away from the platform, and if they could reach it while everyone's attention was on the timber disaster, they had a chance. Silas circled wide, moving through the maze of rail yard equipment, a water tank, a tool shed, a stack of replacement ties. Each piece of cover brought him closer to the train and closer to Cade, who still stood at the platform edge like a patient vulture. Then Silas heard voices approaching. 2 men, walking between the freight cars, checking the couplings. Bounty hunters, from the look of them. Hard men with harder eyes and rifles slung over their shoulders. Silas pressed himself against a boxcar and held his breath. The men passed within 10 feet of him, so close he could smell tobacco and gun oil. They were talking about the woman. "Cade's convinced she's still alive," one said, his voice rough with too much whiskey and not enough sleep. "Says a woman that clever doesn't die easy." "Dead or alive, it's all the same pay," the other replied. "Ashford wants her in that book she stole. Don't matter to him whether we bring her breathing or in a box." "Yeah, but Cade wants her alive, says Ashford's got plans for her before the end." The first man laughed, low and ugly. "Probably wants to make an example. Can't have people thinking they can steal from Marcus Ashford and live to tell about it." They moved on, their voices fading. Silas waited until they were out of sight, then slipped between two freight cars and worked his way toward the caboose. His heart hammered against his ribs, and his hand stayed close to the rifle slung across his back, but he forced himself to move slowly, carefully. Rush now, and he'd get them both killed. He reached the rear of the train and looked back toward where he'd left Evelyn. She was still there, pressed against the depot wall, watching him. Even from this distance, he could see the tension in her posture, the way her hand clutched the carpet bag like a lifeline. Silas waved her forward. She didn't hesitate. She ran, low and fast, her skirts bunched in one hand and the bag in the other. Silas's pulse spiked as he watched her cross the open ground. Too exposed. Too vulnerable. If anyone looked this direction. But no one did. The chaos Greer had created still held everyone's attention. Logs were scattered across 3 rail lines now, and men were arguing about how to clear them. Perfect. Evelyn reached him, breathless and wide-eyed. Silas grabbed the caboose door handle and pulled. Locked. "Of course," he muttered. "What do we do?" Evelyn whispered. Silas looked up at the caboose roof, then at the coupling between the last freight car and the caboose. There was a narrow gap, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, but it would have to do. "Up and over," he said. "Can you climb?" She looked at the ladder rungs on the side of the freight car, then back at him. "In this dress? Unless you've got a better idea." She didn't. She handed him the carpet bag, hiked her skirts up with both hands, and started climbing. Silas followed, the bag slung over his shoulder, his rifle bouncing against his back. The ladder was slick with frost, and twice Evelyn's boots slipped, but she caught herself and kept going. They reached the top of the freight car and lay flat against the roof. From here, Silas could see the entire rail yard spread out below. The timber disaster, the running workers. Cade, still at the platform, now joined by 2 more of his men, and in the distance, Thomas Greer calmly walking away from the scene with his hands in his pockets, his job done. "Now what?" Evelyn asked, her voice barely audible over the locomotive's hiss. "We wait for the train to move, then drop down into the caboose from the roof hatch." "There's a roof hatch?" "Should be. Most cabooses have them." "Should be?" Silas didn't answer. He was watching Cade, who had turned and was scanning the rail yard with the methodical attention of a predator searching for prey. For a terrible moment, Silas thought those cold eyes would land on them, exposed on the rooftop. But then a worker ran up to Cade, gesturing frantically toward the timber spill, and the bounty hunter's attention shifted. The locomotive's whistle screamed, once, twice. The departure signal. "Get ready," Silas said. The train lurched forward. Metal screeched against metal as the couplings took up slack. The freight cars jerked into motion, one after another, and suddenly they were moving. Silas crawled toward the back edge of the freight car roof, Evelyn right behind him. Below, the gap between cars widened and narrowed with the train's motion, a deadly space of grinding metal and crushing weight. Beyond that, the caboose roof, with its small square hatch barely visible. "You're going to jump," Silas said. "I'll go first, then help you across." "Silas?" No time to argue. He didn't give her a chance to protest. He stood, balanced for a moment on the edge of the swaying car, then jumped. For a heartbeat, he was airborne, the ground rushing past below, wind tearing at his coat. Then his boots hit the caboose roof, and he dropped to his knees, grabbing the hatch frame to steady himself. He turned back. "Your turn!" Evelyn stood on the freight car roof, the carpet bag clutched against her chest, terror written across her face. The gap between cars was wider now, the train picking up speed. "I can't." "Yes, you can. Just jump." The train whistle shrieked again. They were clearing the rail yard, picking up speed. In seconds, the gap would be too wide. "Evelyn, now!" She closed her eyes, took 2 running steps, and jumped. Time seemed to slow. Silas saw her arc through the air, skirts billowing, the bag flying from her grip. She was going to make it. She wasn't going to make it. She was falling short. His hand shot out and caught her wrist. The impact nearly pulled him off the roof, but he locked his other arm around the hatch frame and held on. Evelyn slammed against the side of the caboose with a cry of pain, her legs dangling over the coupling gap. "I've got you," Silas grunted, his shoulder screaming in protest. "Climb!" She scrabbled for purchase, found the ladder rungs, and pulled herself up. Silas hauled her the rest of the way, and they collapsed together on the caboose roof, gasping. "The bag," Evelyn said, trying to sit up. "The journal. Landed on the roof. I saw it." Silas crawled forward and retrieved the carpet bag from where it had wedged against the hatch. He handed it to her, and she clutched it like a drowning woman clutching driftwood. Below them, Iron Hollow was falling away, the building shrinking, the rail yard chaos becoming distant and small. They'd made it. They were on the train. Then Silas heard the shout. He turned and looked back. On the platform, Cade stood with his arm raised, pointing directly at them. Even from this distance, Silas could see the fury on the man's face. Around him, his men were running, some toward horses tied near the depot, others toward a smaller locomotive Silas hadn't noticed before, a private engine with a single passenger car attached. "They saw us," Evelyn breathed. "Yeah. What do we do?" Silas pulled the hatch open and looked down into the caboose. Empty, thank the fates. He dropped through, landed in a crouch, then reached up to help Evelyn down. The caboose was small and utilitarian, bunks along one wall, a small stove, windows on all sides. Through the rear window, Silas could see Iron Hollow receding. Through the side window, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The private locomotive was in motion, steam pouring from its stack, already building speed. "They're coming after us," he said. Evelyn moved to the window and watched the pursuing train. Her face had gone pale, but her jaw was set. "How long until they catch us?" "Depends on the engineer. If ours is running light and theirs is pushing hard, maybe 30 minutes? Maybe less." "Can we make the engineer go faster?" "Not without explaining why, and I doubt he'd believe us." Silas looked around the caboose, assessing their options. Not many. The train was picking up speed on the downgrade into the canyon, but the private locomotive was smaller, lighter, built for speed rather than freight. It would catch them. "We can't fight them here," Evelyn said, reading his thoughts. "There's too many of them." "I know." "Then what do we do?" Before Silas could answer, the caboose door burst open. A man filled the doorway, one of Cade's hunters, the one Silas had heard talking about bringing Evelyn in dead or alive. He had his rifle up, already aiming at Evelyn's chest. "Well, well," the man said, grinning. "Cade said you were clever, miss. Didn't mention you had help." Silas moved without thinking. He lunged forward, knocked the rifle barrel aside just as it fired. The shot went wild, punching through the caboose roof. Silas drove his shoulder into the man's gut, and they crashed together through the doorway onto the small rear platform. The wind hit like a hammer. The ground blurred past below, rocks and snow and death. The man recovered fast, brought the rifle butt around in a vicious arc. Silas ducked, felt it whistle past his ear, then drove his fist into the man's kidney. Once, twice, the hunter grunted, stumbled. Silas grabbed the rifle, twisted it free, and in one smooth motion sent it spinning off the platform into the canyon. The man roared, came at him with fists like clubs. They grappled on the narrow platform, each trying to throw the other off, the train swaying beneath them. Through the caboose window, Silas saw Evelyn watching, her hands pressed against the glass, terror in her eyes. The hunter got his hands around Silas's throat and squeezed. Black spots bloomed in Silas's vision. He brought his knee up hard, felt it connect, and the grip loosened just enough. Silas twisted, broke free, and drove his elbow into the man's face. Bone crunched. Blood sprayed. The hunter staggered backward, hit the platform railing, and for a moment teetered on the edge. His eyes went wide. He grabbed for the railing, for Silas, for anything. Silas could have helped him, could have pulled him back. He didn't. The man fell, tumbling backward off the platform. His scream was lost in the wind and the locomotive's roar. Silas didn't watch him hit the ground. He turned back to the caboose, breathing hard, his hands shaking. Evelyn opened the door. Are you hurt? No. He's dead. Yes. She stared at him, and he saw her processing what had just happened, what he'd just done, what he was capable of. He waited for the fear, for the revulsion, for her to look at him the way people had looked at him 15 years ago when they'd pulled him off those bankmen. Instead, she stepped onto the platform and took his hand. Come inside, she said quietly. They went back into the caboose and Silas pulled the door shut. His hands were still shaking. He'd killed men before. The war, mostly, and once or twice since, but it never got easier. Never stopped feeling like something essential had been ripped away. Silas, Evelyn said. He looked at her. Thank you. 2 words. Simple. But they steadied him somehow, brought him back from the edge of whatever dark place he'd been slipping toward. We're not out of this yet, he said. That was just one of them. The rest are on that locomotive behind us. As if summoned by his words, a gunshot cracked. The rear window shattered, spraying glass across the caboose floor. Evelyn screamed and dropped flat. Silas hit the floor beside her and crawled to the broken window. The private locomotive was closer now, close enough that he could see figures on its front platform. 3 men with rifles, taking aim. Another shot punched through the caboose wall, splintering wood. They're not trying to stop us, Evelyn said, her voice tight. They're trying to kill us. Or slow us down until they can board. More shots. The caboose was being systematically torn apart. Silas grabbed his rifle and returned fire, aiming for the locomotive's windows. Glass shattered, and the shooters ducked for cover, but seconds later they were back, firing again. We can't stay here, Silas said. We need to move forward, get into the freight cars where they can't see us. And then what? Then we figure out how to stop them. They ran for the forward door, staying low. Bullets chased them, punching through the thin walls. Silas wrenched the door open, and they stumbled out onto the coupling platform between the caboose and the last freight car. The wind was vicious here, tearing at their clothes, threatening to pull them off the train. Below, the canyon dropped away in a dizzying fall of rock and empty air. The freight car door was closed, locked from the inside. Can you open it? Evelyn shouted over the wind. Silas examined the door. Heavy bolt, designed to be opened from inside. He could shoot the lock, but that would alert everyone on the train to their presence. Then he noticed the ladder on the side of the car. Up again, he said. Evelyn looked at the ladder, at the swaying train, at the pursuing locomotive now less than 3 car lengths behind. Then she nodded and started climbing. They made it to the roof just as another volley of shots tore through the caboose below. From up here, Silas could see the entire train stretching ahead, 10 freight cars, the coal tender, the locomotive. And behind them, the private engine gaining fast, close enough now that he could see Cade standing on the front platform, his black duster whipping in the wind. Keep moving, Silas yelled. They ran across the freight car roof, jumped to the next car, then the next. It was insane, suicidal, running across the tops of swaying train cars with a canyon dropping away on both sides and bullets snapping through the air. But it was better than being trapped in the caboose. They were 3 cars from the locomotive when Evelyn stopped. Silas, wait! He turned. She was looking back at the pursuing train, her expression strange. What is it? I just realized something, she said. They want the journal. They need it. I know. No, you don't understand. She clutched the carpet bag tighter. If I destroy it, they have no reason to keep chasing us. They'll still want you dead. You know too much. Maybe. But without proof, Ashford's empire stays safe. He might be willing to let me go. Silas stared at her. You're not seriously considering. It's the only leverage I have. It's also the only thing that can bring him down. I know. Her voice broke, and he saw tears in her eyes. Whether from wind or emotion, he couldn't tell. But what good is bringing him down if we're both dead? Before Silas could respond, a bullet struck the roof between them, sparking off metal. The private locomotive was right behind the caboose now, close enough to board. In seconds, Cade's men would be climbing up after them. We're out of time, Silas said. Whatever you're going to do it now. Evelyn looked at the bag in her hands, then at the pursuing train. Her face was a mask of agony, years of running, of planning, of hoping for justice, all balanced against the immediate need to survive. Then she made her choice. She turned toward the edge of the freight car and raised the bag high. "Cade!" she screamed. "You want this? Come get it!" And she threw the carpet bag off the train. It arced through the air, tumbling end over end, and fell into the canyon. Silas watched it disappear into the rocks and scrub brush far below, taking with it the journal that could have destroyed Marcus Ashford's empire. On the private locomotive, Cade roared in fury. He gestured frantically, and the train began to slow, falling back. Two of his men jumped off onto the canyon slope, scrambling toward where the bag had fallen. "They're going after it," Evelyn said, her voice hollow. "They don't care about me anymore. They just want the book." The private locomotive was slowing, falling farther behind. But Cade himself wasn't giving up. As Silas watched, the bounty hunter jumped from the slowing train onto the back of the caboose, then started climbing. "One of them's still coming," Silas said grimly. Evelyn turned and saw Cade pulling himself onto the caboose roof. Even from this distance, they could see the cold fury on his face. "Run," Silas said. They ran forward, leaping from car to car, heading for the locomotive. Behind them, Cade followed with the relentless patience of a man who knew his prey was trapped. There was nowhere for them to go but forward, and eventually the train would end. They reached the coal tender and scrambled over the mound of black coal, slipping and sliding. Evelyn fell, and Silas hauled her up. Her hands were black with coal dust, her fine dress torn and filthy. She looked nothing like the frightened Eastern woman he'd first seen in Iron Hollow. She looked like a survivor. They dropped down into the gap between the tender and the locomotive. Through the open door, Silas could see the engineer and fireman, both focused on the track ahead. They hadn't noticed the drama unfolding behind them. "We could tell them," Evelyn said. "Get them to help. Or they panic and stop the train, and we're sitting ducks." "Then what?" Silas looked back. Cade had crossed the freight cars and was climbing over the coal tender. He'd pulled one of his revolvers, and his face was a mask of cold determination. "We make a stand," Silas said. He pulled Evelyn down behind the tender's low wall and raised his rifle. "Right here." Cade cleared the coal pile and dropped into the gap with them. For a moment, the three of them stood there, balanced on the swaying platform between the tender and the locomotive, the wind screaming around them. "You made a mistake, miss," Cade said, his voice surprisingly calm. "Throwing away your only bargaining chip." "Maybe," Evelyn said. "Or maybe I just saved both our lives." Cade smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You think Ashford will let you live now that you've proven you can't be controlled? You think he'll just forget about the money you stole, the humiliation you caused him?" "I think he has bigger problems than me now," Evelyn said. "Without that journal, he has no idea what I've already told people. What evidence I might have sent east. He'll spend the rest of his life wondering if I'm the threat that brings him down." Cade's smile faded. He raised his revolver, aimed it at Evelyn's heart. Silas stepped between them. "Move, mountain man," Cade said. "This doesn't concern you." "It does now." "You'll die for her?" Silas didn't answer. He just stood there, rifle lowered but ready, his body shielding Evelyn. Cade studied him, then shook his head. "Foolish, but I suppose that's what love makes men." The word hit Silas like a physical blow. Love. Was that what this was? This desperate need to protect her? This willingness to die for a woman he'd known less than a week? He didn't have time to process it. Cade's finger tightened on the trigger. Then Evelyn moved. She grabbed Silas's arm and pulled him sideways just as Cade fired. The bullet missed by inches, struck the locomotive's boiler with a metallic ping. The engineer shouted in alarm, and suddenly the locomotive was slowing, brakes screaming. The sudden deceleration threw all three of them off balance. Cade stumbled, caught himself on the tender's edge. Silas raised his rifle, but Evelyn was in the way, and he couldn't get a clear shot. Cade recovered first. He lunged forward, grabbed Evelyn by the hair, and yanked her toward the edge of the platform. She screamed, clawing at his hand, her feet slipping on the metal grating. Silas dropped the rifle and dove at Cade, catching him around the waist. They crashed together against the tender, grappling. Cade's revolver went off again, the shot going wild. The train was still slowing, the canyon walls sliding past at a crawl now. Cade brought the revolver down toward Silas's head. Silas caught his wrist, twisted. They fought for the gun, straining against each other. Cade was strong, wiry, and fast, but Silas had 50 pounds on him and 15 years of surviving in the mountains. With a roar, Silas drove Cade backward. The bounty hunter's shoulders hit the platform railing. For a moment they were locked together, neither able to gain advantage. Then Evelyn was there. She'd grabbed Silas's fallen rifle and swung it like a club, connecting with the side of Cade's head. The bounty hunter's eyes rolled back. His grip on Silas loosened. Silas didn't hesitate. He shoved hard, and Cade went over the railing. The bounty hunter didn't scream. He just fell, silent and tumbling, and hit the canyon floor hard enough that Silas heard the impact even over the locomotive's noise. The train shuddered to a complete stop. The engineer was climbing down from the cab, shouting questions. Behind them, the private locomotive had reversed course and was heading back toward Iron Hollow, probably to retrieve the men who'd gone after the journal. Silas turned to Evelyn. She was still holding the rifle, her chest heaving, her eyes wide with shock. "You saved my life," he said. She looked at him, then at the rifle in her hands, then back at him. "You saved mine first." They stood there on the stopped train, covered in coal dust and blood, survivors of a battle they'd somehow won. Around them, the canyon stretched away in silence, and overhead, the sky was a perfect, brutal blue. The engineer reached them, full of questions and accusations. But Silas barely heard him. All he could see was Evelyn, alive and whole, and the choice she'd made, throwing away her only leverage, her only hope of justice, to save them both. Later, he would learn that the choice hadn't been what it seemed, that Evelyn Harrow was far cleverer than even he had given her credit for. But in that moment, standing on a stopped train in the middle of a Wyoming canyon, he simply pulled her close and held on, knowing they'd crossed a line together that neither could uncross. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The engineer's name was Porter, and he didn't believe a word of their story. "Bounty hunters on my train," he said, his weathered face red with anger and disbelief. "Men shooting at passengers, bodies falling off platforms. You expect me to believe all that?" They stood beside the stopped locomotive, the canyon stretching silent and vast around them. Porter's fireman, a young man named Walsh, was checking the boiler where Cade's bullet had struck, making sure the damage wasn't serious. The other crew members, a conductor and 2 brakemen, had emerged from the forward cars, drawn by the gunfire and sudden stop. "Believe what you want," Silas said, his voice flat with exhaustion. "But there's a dead man in that canyon, and if you go back to Iron Hollow, you'll find more of them waiting. Then we'll get the sheriff involved. Let the law sort this out." "The sheriff's in Ashford's pocket," Evelyn said. "He won't help us. He'll hand me over to whoever's paying him the most." Porter's eyes narrowed. "Ashford, Marcus Ashford. You know him?" "Every railroad man west of the Mississippi knows Marcus Ashford. Man owns half the Union Pacific and wants to own the rest." Porter looked at Evelyn with new interest, taking in her torn dress and coal-stained hands. "What'd you do to get on his bad side?" "Refused to marry him," Evelyn said simply. "And took something that belongs to my father." "The money," Porter said. It wasn't a question. "Part of it." Porter was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working like he was chewing on a particularly tough piece of gristle. Finally, he spat into the dirt and shook his head. "I don't get paid enough for this," he muttered. Then, louder, "I can take you as far as Rawlins. After that, you're on your own, and if anyone asks, I never saw you." "Thank you," Evelyn said. "Don't thank me yet. We've got 100 miles of track between here and Rawlins, and if Ashford's men are smart, they'll wire ahead. Could be a welcoming committee waiting when we arrive." "Then we'll deal with it when we get there," Silas said. Porter looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. "You're the mountain man everyone talks about. Boone, right? The one who went up into the high country and never came back down." "I came down." "Yeah, you did. Question is why?" Silas glanced at Evelyn, who was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Seemed like the thing to do," Porter snorted. "You're either the bravest man I've ever met or the stupidest. Either way, get back in the caboose and stay out of sight. Last thing I need is passengers asking why there's bullet holes everywhere." They did as he asked, climbing back through the freight cars to the battered caboose. The interior was destroyed, windows shot out, walls splintered. the small stove knocked loose from its moorings. But it was shelter, and after what they'd been through, even this wreckage felt like sanctuary. The train lurched into motion again. Silas watched through the broken rear window as the canyon where Cade had fallen disappeared around a curve. Somewhere back there, men were searching for the carpetbag Evelyn had thrown away, tearing through rocks and brush, desperate to recover the journal that would save their employer's empire. They would find it eventually. And when they opened it, they would discover Evelyn's final gambit. "You want to tell me what was really in that bag?" Silas asked. Evelyn sat on one of the broken bunks, her hands folded in her lap. She looked exhausted, her face pale beneath the grime, but there was something else in her expression now, a fierce satisfaction that hadn't been there before. "A decoy," she said. Silas turned from the window. "What?" "The journal I threw off the train was a fake. Pages of random numbers and names I copied from a ledger book I bought in Philadelphia. It looks convincing, good enough to fool someone at a glance, but it's worthless." Silas stared at her. "The real journal?" "Hidden, back in Iron Hollow." For a moment, Silas couldn't speak. The sheer audacity of it, the calculated risk, left him speechless. She'd bet everything on a bluff, thrown away a fake, while the real evidence, the genuine threat to Ashford, remained safe. "Where?" he finally asked. "Thomas Greer's forge. I gave it to him the night before the storm, before I tried to leave town with Crofton. Told him if I didn't come back for it within a month, he should send it to the Philadelphia Inquirer." "You trusted him with that?" "I didn't have a choice. I needed someone who wouldn't be connected to me, someone Ashford's men wouldn't think to question." She met his eyes. "And you said he was honest." "I said he was honest for a blacksmith. That's not the same thing." "Well, we'll find out, won't we?" Silas sat down heavily on the opposite bunk, his mind racing. If Greer kept his word, the journal was safe. If he didn't, if Ashford's men somehow learned about it and got to him first, then everything Evelyn had done, all the running, all the risk, would be for nothing. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. "Because the fewer people who knew, the better. If Cade had captured you, tortured you—" She stopped, her voice catching. "I couldn't risk it. So you were going to let me think you'd thrown away your only leverage?" "Yes. Let me believe you'd given up justice for survival." "Yes." Silas shook his head, not quite able to decide if he was angry or impressed. "You're either the smartest woman I've ever met or the most reckless. Can't I be both?" Despite everything, he found himself smiling. "Yeah, you can." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the rhythm of the rails, watching the landscape roll past through the broken windows. The canyon gave way to high plains, snow-covered and empty, stretching to distant mountains that rose like broken teeth against the sky. "What happens when we reach Rollins?" Evelyn asked. "We disappear. Find a way back to Iron Hollow without being seen, retrieve the journal, and get you somewhere safe." "And then?" "Then you send that journal east. Bring down Ashford and his whole rotten empire." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "And what about you? What about me? What will you do after all this is over?" It was a good question. Silas had spent 15 years with one goal: survive, day after day, season after season, asking nothing from the world but to be left alone. But now, sitting here with Evelyn, he realized that survival wasn't enough anymore. Somewhere in the last week, something had shifted. He'd started living again instead of just existing. "Don't know," he said honestly. "Haven't thought that far ahead." "You could come with me, east, I mean. Start over somewhere new." The offer hung in the air between them. Silas thought about Philadelphia, about cities full of people and noise and the kind of civilization he'd fled from 15 years ago. The idea should have repulsed him. But looking at Evelyn, imagining a life where he didn't wake up alone every morning, he felt something stir that he'd thought was long dead. "Maybe," he said. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. The train rattled on through the afternoon and into evening. Walsh, the fireman, brought them water and some food he'd scrounged from the crew's supplies. Hard bread and cheese, but after days of limited rations, it tasted like a feast. He also brought news. "Porter wired ahead from the last water stop," Walsh said, keeping his voice low. Warned the Rollins station master that we might have trouble. Told him to have the sheriff standing by, just in case. Can we trust the Rollins sheriff? Evelyn asked. Walsh shrugged. He's straight enough, I guess. But if Ashford's people get to him first with the right story, fugitive thieves, stolen money, whatever lie they're spinning, he'll side with them. Law tends to favor whoever looks more respectable. And Evelyn, with her torn dress and wild hair and the hunted look that still lingered in her eyes, wouldn't look respectable at all. We'll get off before Rollins, Silas said, soon as we're close enough to walk. It's 20 miles of open country, Walsh warned, and the temperature's dropping. You'll freeze. We've survived worse. Walsh looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Silas's expression stopped him. He nodded, handed over a blanket he'd brought, and left. As night fell, they huddled together for warmth in the broken caboose, the blanket wrapped around both of them. Outside, stars emerged in a sky so clear and vast, it seemed to swallow the world. Silas had seen the sky 1,000 times from his cabin, but tonight it looked different somehow. Less lonely. Silas, Evelyn said softly. Yeah? Back on the train, when Cade said that word, love, did he... She stopped, struggling with the words. Did he see something I didn't? Silas was quiet for a long time. Love. He'd loved Sarah, loved her with the kind of fierce devotion that made her death nearly destroy him. What he felt for Evelyn was different, newer, rawer, built on crisis rather than years of shared life. But was it love? I don't know, he said finally. I just know that when I thought you might die in that storm, something in me broke. And when I thought Cade might kill you today, I knew I'd do anything to stop him. That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got. Evelyn was quiet, her head resting against his shoulder. Then, so softly he almost didn't hear it. It's enough. They slept fitfully, waking at every jolt and sway of the train. Sometime near midnight, Silas woke to find Evelyn crying silently, her shoulders shaking. He didn't ask why. He just held her until the tears stopped, and she fell back asleep. He understood. The adrenaline was fading, the shock wearing off, and she was finally processing everything that had happened. The violence, the terror, the weight of the choices she'd made. Tomorrow she would be strong again. Tonight she was allowed to break. Dawn came gray and cold. Porter slowed the train as they approached a water tower 10 miles outside Rollins, and Silas and Evelyn slipped off while the crew was busy refilling the locomotive's tanks. No one saw them go. Porter had made sure of it. They walked east across the frozen plains, following the rail line but staying far enough away to avoid being seen. The wind cut through their clothes, and by mid-morning, Silas's face was numb and Evelyn was shaking with cold despite the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. How much farther? She asked through chattering teeth. Another hour, maybe 2. I don't think I can make it. Yes, you can. He took her hand and pulled her forward, step by step, mile by mile. When she stumbled, he caught her. When she wanted to stop, he wouldn't let her. He'd carried her out of a blizzard once before. He'd carry her through this too if he had to. They reached the outskirts of Rollins near noon. The town was bigger than Iron Hollow, a proper railroad hub with hotels, saloons, shops, and a brick courthouse that spoke to prosperity and permanence. But prosperity also meant more people, more eyes, more chances of being recognized. Silas led them through back alleys and between buildings, avoiding the main streets. They needed supplies, food, warmer clothes, money for travel, but every store was a risk. Finally, he spotted what he was looking for, a second-hand shop, small and dingy, tucked between a feed store and a boarded-up saloon. Wait here, he told Evelyn, leaving her in an alley behind the shop. I'll be quick. Inside, the shop smelled of mothballs and old leather. A woman behind the counter looked up as he entered, her eyes narrowing at his rough appearance. Help you? Need clothes. For a woman, about this tall. He held his hand at Evelyn's height. Traveling clothes. Warm. The woman's expression suggested she'd heard this request before and knew what it usually meant. A man buying clothes for someone he shouldn't be with. But she didn't ask questions. She just pulled items from the racks. A wool dress, a heavy coat, boots, gloves. $15, she said. Silas had money. Not much, but enough. He'd brought what little he kept hidden at his cabin. He paid, took the bundle of clothes, and left before the woman could change her mind about the transaction. In the alley, Evelyn changed quickly, her modesty abandoned in favor of speed and warmth. The second-hand clothes fit reasonably well, and more importantly, they were practical, nothing that would draw attention or mark her as the refined Eastern woman Ashford's men were hunting for. "Better?" Silas asked. She nodded, pulling the coat tight. "Much." "Good. Because we're not staying." They needed to get back to Iron Hollow, but the trains would be watched. That left one option. They'd have to buy or steal horses and ride the 100 miles through country that was still locked in winter's grip. Silas knew a man in Rawlins, a horse trader named Dalton, who operated out of a corral on the west edge of town. Dalton was a scoundrel and a cheat, but he asked no questions as long as the money was good. They found him in his corral, examining a bay mare's teeth. He looked up as they approached, his eyes narrowing in recognition. "Boone, thought you were dead." "Not yet." "Heard there was some excitement on the eastbound freight this morning. Something about shooting and bodies falling off trains." Dalton's gaze shifted to Evelyn. "You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" "Need 2 horses," Silas said, ignoring the question. "Sound and willing, plus tack. That'll cost you." "How much?" "For horses? 50 each. Saddles and gear? Another 20. It was highway robbery, and they both knew it. But Silas didn't have time to negotiate. "I'll give you 80 for everything," Dalton laughed. "You must think I'm stupid." "I think you're smart enough to know when to take a deal and not ask questions." Dalton studied them both, his expression calculating. Then he nodded. 80, cash, and I never saw you." The transaction was completed in minutes. Dalton brought out 2 horses, not the best in his corral, but not the worst either. A roan gelding for Silas and a smaller buckskin mare for Evelyn. The tack was worn, but serviceable. As they were saddling up, Dalton spoke again. "Word of advice, Boone. Whatever you're running from, you might want to run faster. There's been men asking about a woman, telegrams coming through all morning, sheriffs getting nervous." "What kind of men?" "The kind with money and no conscience. They're offering $1,000 for information leading to her capture." $1,000. In a town like Rawlins, that kind of money would turn even honest men into betrayers. "How long before they find us?" Evelyn asked. "If I were you," Dalton said, "I'd already be gone." They rode out of Rawlins at a gallop, heading west into the open country. Behind them, the town fell away, and ahead the mountains rose like a wall against the sky. They rode hard through the afternoon, pushing the horses as much as they dared. The landscape was brutal and beautiful, endless plains of snow broken by rocky outcrops and stands of pine that looked black against the white. The temperature dropped as the sun sank toward the horizon, and Silas knew they'd have to find shelter soon or risk freezing. Just before dark, they spotted smoke rising in the distance. A homestead, isolated and small, nestled in a shallow valley. Silas approached cautiously, one hand on his rifle. The house was a sod structure with a stone chimney, and a barn stood nearby, its roof sagging under the weight of snow. An old man emerged as they rode up, a shotgun cradled in his arms. His face was weathered as old leather, and his eyes were sharp despite his age. "State your business," he said, not quite aiming the shotgun at them, but making it clear he could. "Looking for shelter," Silas said. "Just for the night. We can pay." The old man looked them over. 2 people on tired horses, obviously running from something. "How much trouble you bringing to my door?" "Hopefully none. But I won't lie to you, there might be men following us." "What kind of men?" "The kind you don't want to meet." The old man was quiet for a long moment. Then he lowered the shotgun. "Barn's warm enough if you don't mind sleeping with the horses. I'll bring you food. But come morning, you're gone." "Fair enough." They bedded down in the barn, making a nest in the hay. The old man was true to his word, bringing them stew and bread and asking no more questions. As darkness fell and the temperature plummeted, Silas built a small fire in a metal bucket and they huddled close to it, eating in silence. "Do you think we'll make it?" Evelyn asked. "To Iron Hollow?" "To anywhere safe." Silas poked at the fire with a stick, watching sparks rise and die in the cold air. "I think we've got a chance. Better than we had yesterday." That's not exactly reassuring. It's the truth. Evelyn smiled despite herself. You're terrible at giving comfort. You know that? Never been much good at it. Sarah must have been a patient woman. The mention of Sarah's name didn't hurt the way it once had. The wound was still there, but it had scarred over, become something he could live with. She was, Silas said. Patient and stubborn and braver than I ever was. I think you're pretty brave. I'm just too stupid to quit. That's not true. You came after me in that storm because you're good, because you couldn't stand the thought of someone else dying when you could have saved them. Silas met her eyes across the fire. Maybe. Or maybe I was just tired of being alone. The words hung between them, honest and raw. Evelyn reached across the small fire and took his hand. You're not alone anymore, she said. That night they slept wrapped in each other's arms, not for warmth alone, but for the comfort of another human presence. And for the first time in 15 years, Silas didn't dream of Sarah dying. He dreamed of mountains and a cabin and a woman who might stay. They left before dawn, while the old man was still asleep. Silas left money on the barn workbench, more than the shelter was worth, and they rode west into the breaking day. It took them 2 more days to reach Iron Hollow, moving carefully, avoiding the main roads, sleeping rough in whatever shelter they could find. They saw no sign of pursuit, but Silas knew that didn't mean they were safe. Ashford's men would have found the decoy journal by now. They would know they'd been tricked, and they would be looking for revenge. They approached Iron Hollow from the north, through the logging trails where Silas had first found Evelyn half frozen beneath a wagon. The town looked quiet as they observed it from the tree line, smoke rising from chimneys, people going about their business, no obvious signs of danger. But Silas had learned not to trust appearances. We go in after dark, he said, straight to Greer's forge. Get the journal and leave. And if Ashford's men are there, then we fight. It was a simple plan, with 100 ways it could go wrong, but it was all they had. They waited in the trees as afternoon faded to evening and evening to night. When full darkness fell and most of the town's lights had gone out, they rode down into Iron Hollow, keeping to the shadows, moving like ghosts through the frozen streets. The forge was dark, no smoke from the chimney. Silas's stomach tightened. That could mean Greer had simply closed up for the night, or it could mean something worse. They tied the horses behind the building and approached the back door. Unlocked. Not a good sign. Greer always locked his shop. Silas pushed the door open slowly, rifle ready. Inside, darkness and the smell of cold metal. He struck a match, and in its brief flare, saw that the forge was empty. The tools still hung on their pegs, the anvil stood silent, everything in its place. But Thomas Greer was gone. Evelyn moved deeper into the shop, searching. The journal, where would he have hidden it? I don't know. He didn't tell you? He just said he'd keep it safe. They searched quickly, quietly, going through the obvious places first, the desk, the tool chest, the small office in back. Nothing. Then Silas remembered something Greer had mentioned once, years ago, about hiding valuables where thieves wouldn't think to look. He went to the forge itself, cold now, and reached up inside the chimney. His fingers found metal, a small box wedged into a gap in the stonework. He pulled it free and opened it. Inside was the journal, the real one. Evelyn's father's neat handwriting, page after page of names and numbers and damning evidence. You found it, Evelyn breathed. Yeah, but where's Greer? The answer came in the form of footsteps outside, multiple sets approaching fast. Then the front door crashed open and men poured in, lanterns blazing, guns drawn. At their head was a man Silas had never seen before, tall and distinguished, with silver hair and expensive clothes that looked absurdly out of place in the rough forge. He carried himself with the absolute confidence of someone who'd never been told no in his life. Miss Harrow, the man said, his voice cultured and cold. How delightful to finally meet you in person. I'm Marcus Ashford. Evelyn went pale. Silas moved in front of her, rifle coming up, but there were too many men, too many guns. They were surrounded, trapped. Ashford smiled. I believe you have something that belongs to me. Silas kept his rifle trained on Ashford, but his mind was racing, calculating angles and odds. 6 armed men in the forge, probably more outside. Even if he managed to shoot Ashford, they'd be cut down before they could take another step. The only thing keeping them alive right now was the journal clutched in Evelyn's hands. "Where's Thomas Greer?" Silas asked, his voice hard. Ashford glanced at one of his men, who stepped forward dragging something heavy. They dropped it at Silas's feet. Thomas Greer, bloodied and barely conscious, his hands bound behind his back. The blacksmith's face was a mass of bruises, one eye swollen shut, and blood ran from his nose and mouth. "Mr. Greer was remarkably stubborn," Ashford said with cold amusement. "Took considerable persuasion before he revealed where he'd hidden the journal. I admire loyalty, but it's such a wasteful virtue when applied to lost causes." Evelyn made a sound of horror and started to move toward Greer, but Silas caught her arm and held her back. This was exactly what Ashford wanted. For them to make a mistake, to give him an excuse. "You got what you came for," Silas said. "Let him go." "I'm afraid that's not quite how this works, Mr. Boone." Ashford took a step closer, his eyes fixed on the journal. "You see, I have the blacksmith, but Miss Harrow still has my property. A trade seems in order." "The journal for Greer's life," Evelyn said, her voice shaking but steady. "Not quite. The journal for both your lives. All three of you." Ashford smiled, but it never reached his eyes. "I'm a businessman, Miss Harrow. I don't waste resources on revenge when I don't have to. Give me the journal, and you can all walk away from this. You have my word." "Your word," Evelyn said bitterly, "isn't worth the breath it takes to speak it." Ashford's expression hardened. "Perhaps not, but it's the only offer you're going to get. The alternative is that my men kill Mr. Boone right now, and then we take the journal from you anyway. Either way, I get what I want. This way, you might actually survive." Silas watched Evelyn's face, saw the war playing out there. She knew Ashford was lying. The moment he had that journal, they were all dead. But what choice did they have? If she refused, Silas died. If she surrendered, they all died. It was a trap with no way out. Unless they changed the game. "Before you make any deals," Silas said quietly to Evelyn, "ask him about your father." Ashford's eyes flickered, just for a moment, but Silas caught it. "What about my father?" Evelyn demanded, turning to Ashford. "Your father is comfortable and well cared for," Ashford said smoothly, "as he will continue to be, provided you cooperate." "You're lying," Evelyn said. "You wouldn't have come all this way yourself if you had him as leverage. You'd have just threatened to hurt him unless I gave you what you wanted. But you're here, which means either you don't have him or—" Her voice caught. "Or he's already dead." The silence that followed was answer enough. Evelyn's face went white. "When?" "2 weeks ago," Ashford said, and now his voice carried a hint of irritation. "A stroke. The doctor said it was quick. I had nothing to do with it, if that's what you're thinking." "But you let me keep running. Let me think I was protecting him. Let me believe—" Evelyn's voice broke. "You bastard!" "I needed you desperate enough to make mistakes," Ashford said. "A woman protecting her father is cautious, careful. A woman who thinks she still has something to lose can be controlled. It was simply good strategy." Silas felt Evelyn sway beside him and tightened his grip on her arm. She was trembling now, rage and grief warring inside her. He'd seen men break under less, had broken himself under the weight of losing Sarah. But Evelyn didn't break. She straightened, her jaw set, and when she spoke, her voice was ice. "You want the journal? Come and take it." She threw it. Not at Ashford, but into the forge, into the cold ashes and dead coals. For one frozen moment, everyone stared. Then chaos erupted. Ashford lunged for the forge, shouting. His men moved to follow, and Silas moved faster than he'd moved in 15 years. He drove his shoulder into the nearest gunman, sent him crashing into 2 others. His rifle came up, fired. One of the lanterns exploded, plunging half the forge into darkness. "Run!" he shouted to Evelyn. She didn't run. She grabbed a heavy hammer from Greer's workbench and swung it at the man closest to her. It connected with his shoulder and he went down screaming. Then she was at Greer's side, cutting his bonds with a piece of sharp metal. Silas fired again, aiming high, trying to scatter Ashford's men without killing them if he could help it. But they were recovering from the surprise, bringing their weapons to bear. A bullet whined past Silas's ear. Another punched through the wall behind him. He grabbed an iron bar from the workbench and threw it at the remaining lantern. Glass shattered, oil spilled, and suddenly there was fire, Real fire, spreading across the wooden floor, catching on the spilled oil, racing toward the walls. "Out the back!" Silas yelled. Evelyn and Greer stumbled toward the rear door. Silas fired twice more, giving them cover, then turned to follow. But Ashford was there, rising from the forge with the journal clutched in his hands, his expensive clothes smudged with ash. And behind him, two of his men had their rifles aimed directly at Evelyn. "Stop!" Ashford commanded. Silas froze. The fire was spreading fast now, flames licking up the walls, smoke beginning to fill the air. In minutes, the whole building would be an inferno. "I have the journal," Ashford said, holding it up. "I have what I came for, but I find that I'm no longer in a generous mood. You humiliated me, Miss Harrow. Cost me time, money, and reputation. That requires a response." "Then respond to me," Silas said, stepping forward. "Let them go. Keep me." "Silas, no," Evelyn started. "Shut up," he said, not taking his eyes off Ashford. "Let them go. I'm the one who helped her. I'm the one who killed your men. This is between you and me." Ashford considered this, his face thoughtful despite the smoke and fire. "An interesting proposition, but I think not. You see, Mr. Boone, I've learned that the best way to hurt someone isn't to kill them. It's to make them watch while you destroy everything they care about." He nodded to his men. "Kill them. All of them." The rifles came up. Silas dove to the side, bringing his own rifle around, knowing he was too slow, too late. This was it. This was how it ended. Then the back door exploded inward. Men poured through, rail workers, loggers, townspeople, led by Porter the engineer and Walsh the fireman. They had axes, hammers, rifles. And at their head, bloodied but alive, was Thomas Greer himself, who'd somehow broken free from Evelyn and circled around to get help. "Ashford!" Porter shouted. "It's over!" The forge was chaos now. Fire on one side, armed townspeople on the other, Ashford's men caught in the middle. Some of them tried to fight, but they were overwhelmed. Others dropped their weapons and raised their hands. Ashford himself stood frozen, the journal still clutched in his hands, his face a mask of disbelief. How had it come to this? His money, his power, his carefully constructed empire. None of it meant anything here, in this burning building, surrounded by people who'd decided they'd had enough of men like him. Silas moved toward him. "It's over," he said quietly. "Let it go." For a moment he thought Ashford might actually surrender. Then the railroad magnate's face twisted with rage and he lunged, not at Silas, but at Evelyn, a knife appearing in his hand from somewhere. A final desperate attempt to hurt someone before the end. Silas was faster. His fist caught Ashford in the jaw, a solid punch that dropped the older man like a stone. The knife clattered away. The journal fell from Ashford's hands and Evelyn snatched it up, holding it tight against her chest. "Get everyone out!" Greer shouted. "This whole place is going up!" They fled into the street as the forge became an inferno behind them. Flames roared through the roof, sparks fountaining into the night sky. The townspeople formed a bucket brigade, trying to keep the fire from spreading to other buildings, but Greer's forge was lost. Ashford's men were rounded up, disarmed, tied with rope. Ashford himself lay unconscious in the snow, blood running from his split lip. Porter stood over him with a rifle, making sure he didn't get any ideas about running when he woke. Silas found Evelyn standing apart from the crowd, still clutching the journal, tears streaming down her face. Not tears of fear or pain, but of grief finally released. Her father was gone. The man she'd been running to protect, fighting to save, was dead, and had been dead for weeks while she'd risked everything for nothing. "I'm sorry," Silas said, putting his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him, her whole body shaking. "He died thinking I'd abandoned him, thinking I'd run away and left him to Ashford's mercy. He knew you loved him. That's what matters." "Is it? Is it enough?" Silas didn't have an answer for that. All he could do was hold her while she cried and watch the forge burn and wonder what happened next. The answer came with the dawn. Porter and several other townspeople had tied Ashford and his men in the depot under guard. When the railroad magnate finally regained consciousness, he found himself facing not just angry townspeople, but something worse. The truth of what he'd done, laid bare by the very journal he'd been so desperate to destroy. Evelyn had spent the hours before dawn sitting at a table in Porter's locomotive cab, carefully copying pages from the journal by lamplight. Not all of it, that would take days, but the most damning sections. Names of judges and politicians who'd taken bribes, details of land seized illegally, records of violence ordered and paid for. And she made 3 copies, not 1. Insurance, she explained to Silas as she worked, her eyes red-rimmed but focused. 1 copy goes to the Philadelphia Inquirer, 1 to the federal marshal in Denver, and 1 stays here with Porter in case something happens to the others. You think the papers will actually print it? I think a scandal this big, involving men this powerful, they'll fight each other for the chance. She was right. By the time the westbound stage finally made it through 2 days later, the passes had cleared enough for travel. 3 sealed envelopes were ready to go. Porter personally handed them to the driver with instructions to guard them with his life. What about Ashford? Silas asked. We can't hold him forever. We don't have to, Greer said. He was sitting on a bench outside the depot, his face still bruised but his spirits unbroken. Federal marshal's been wired. He'll be here in 3 days to take custody. By then, every newspaper east of the Mississippi will be running the story. He'll try to buy his way out, Evelyn said. Men like him always do. Maybe, Greer acknowledged, but it'll cost him everything he has, and he'll still probably end up in prison. That's a kind of justice. It wasn't perfect justice. It wasn't Sarah getting to live or Evelyn's father being freed from debt or any of the other wrongs being made right. But it was something. It was powerful men facing consequences for the first time in their lives. Silas could live with that. Over the next few days, as they waited for the marshal to arrive, Iron Hollow transformed. The story of what had happened, how a woman had stolen evidence and run, how a mountain man had risked everything to protect her, how townspeople had stood up to one of the most powerful men in the territory, spread through the rail camps and logging operations like wildfire. People came from miles around just to see Ashford locked in the depot, brought low. Some came to spit curses at him. Others just stared in silence, seeing for the first time that power wasn't permanent, that giants could fall. Evelyn spent most of those days in Porter's locomotive, resting. The physical exhaustion and emotional toll of the past weeks had caught up with her, and she slept for nearly 20 hours straight. When she finally emerged, pale and quiet, Silas was waiting. How are you feeling? He asked. Like I survived something I shouldn't have, she said. Like I'm not sure what comes next. I know the feeling. They walked to the edge of town where the mountains rose stark and beautiful against the sky. The snow was beginning to melt in the lower elevations, revealing patches of brown earth and the first hints of spring grass. Winter was ending. The world was changing. I have to go back east, Evelyn said, to Philadelphia, settle my father's affairs, make sure the journal gets into the right hands. She paused. And I have to testify. If there's a trial, they'll need me. I know. It could take months, maybe years. I know that too. She turned to face him. Come with me. It was the second time she'd asked. The first time, in the broken caboose, Silas had said maybe. Now, with space to think and time to process everything that had happened, he had to give her a real answer. I can't, he said. Pain flickered across her face. Why not? Because that's your world, Evelyn. Courts and lawyers and cities full of people. It's not mine. I tried living in civilization once. It broke me. You're not broken. Not anymore, he admitted. But I'm also not who I'd have to be to survive there. I'm a mountain man. It's not just what I do. It's who I am. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the mountains. Then, so this is goodbye. It doesn't have to be. What else could it be? Silas took a breath. This was harder than facing down Cade's guns, harder than fighting through a blizzard. But Evelyn deserved honesty. Come back, he said. When it's over, when you've done what you need to do in Philadelphia, come back here. To Iron Hollow? To the high country. To my cabin. He met her eyes. To me. She stared at him. You're asking me to leave everything behind, my old life, the city, everything I know. I'm asking you to choose. Not right now. You need time. But later, when the dust settles and the trials are done, And you've had a chance to figure out who you are without your father's debt hanging over you. Then choose. And if I choose the city, then I'll know you made the right choice for you, and I'll be glad you survived. That's all? Silas smiled, sad and honest. That's all I can promise. I'm not going to beg you to love a life you hate. But if you think you could be happy in the mountains, with a man who doesn't talk much and a cabin that's colder than hell in winter, then the door's open. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. You're an impossible man, Silas Boone. I know. You're also the best man I've ever known. I'm not. Yes, you are. She took his hands. And I don't know if I'll come back. I don't know what I'll want when all this is over, but I promise I'll think about it. I'll really think about it. That's all I'm asking. The federal marshal arrived the next day, a hard-eyed man named Barrett, who looked like he'd seen every kind of criminal and wasn't impressed by any of them. He took custody of Ashford and his men, loaded them into a reinforced wagon, and prepared to transport them to Denver for trial. Before he left, Evelyn gave him a full statement, everything that had happened from the moment Ashford had tried to force her into marriage to the showdown in the burning forge. Barrett listened carefully, taking notes, and when she was done, he nodded. This testimony, combined with the journal evidence, should be enough to put him away for a long time, he said. But I'll need you to testify in person when the trial starts. Can you do that? Yes, Evelyn said firmly. I can do that. Barrett turned to Silas. And you, Mr. Boone. I understand you killed several men during this affair. Silas tensed, wondering if he was about to be arrested, but Barrett's expression wasn't accusatory. Self-defense, the marshal said. From what I hear, they were trying to kill you and Miss Harrow. I'll need a statement, but I don't anticipate charges. The men you killed were wanted for other crimes anyway. You probably did us a favor. Relief washed through Silas. He'd half expected to end this whole thing in a jail cell, but apparently frontier justice still had some flexibility left in it. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me. Thank Miss Harrow. She's the one who brought down a criminal empire. You just helped her stay alive long enough to do it. When Barrett's wagon finally rolled out of Iron Hollow, with Ashford and his men locked inside, the whole town turned out to watch. There was no cheering, no celebration, just the quiet satisfaction of seeing justice, imperfect as it was, being served. Evelyn left 2 days later on the westbound stage. Silas rode with her to the depot, helped her with her bags, new ones, since her original carpet bag had been lost somewhere in the chaos. She wore the second-hand clothes he'd bought her in Rawlins, practical traveling clothes that made her look like any other woman heading east. But she wasn't any other woman. She was Evelyn Harrow, the woman who'd brought down Marcus Ashford, the woman who'd survived a blizzard and a train chase and a burning building, the woman who'd changed Silas's life in ways he was still figuring out. This is it, she said as the stage driver called for final boarding. For now, she smiled. For now. Then she kissed him, there in front of the whole town, a kiss that was goodbye and maybe and promise all tangled together. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright with tears. All right, she said. I'd like that. And Silas? Yeah? Thank you for everything. He wanted to tell her she didn't need to thank him, that she'd given him as much as he'd given her, a reason to live instead of just survive, a reminder that the world still had good people worth fighting for. But the words stuck in his throat, so he just nodded. She climbed into the stage. The driver cracked his whip, and Silas stood in the street watching until the stage disappeared around a bend and she was gone. The mountains were quiet that spring. Snow melted in the passes, revealing trails that had been buried for months. Wildflowers bloomed in the high meadows, painting the landscape in colors Silas had forgotten existed. He worked on his cabin, making repairs he'd put off for years, and found himself thinking about what it would be like if Evelyn came back. Where would she sleep? Would she want her own space or share his? How would they handle the long winters when cabin fever set in? He was building a second room onto the cabin, just in case, when Porter rode up one afternoon in early June. Got something for you, the engineer said, dismounting. He pulled an envelope from his saddlebag and handed it over. Silas recognized the handwriting immediately. He opened it there, standing in the sunshine, and read. The letter was 3 pages long, written in Evelyn's neat script. She told him about Philadelphia, about settling her father's affairs, and discovering he'd left her a small inheritance, not much, but enough to live on. She told him about the newspapers, which had indeed published the journal's revelations and sparked a scandal that reached all the way to Washington. Ashford was awaiting trial, his business empire in ruins, his associates fleeing like rats from a sinking ship. She told him about the nights when she couldn't sleep, when the memories of the storm and the train and the burning forge came back to haunt her. And she told him about the mornings when she woke up thinking about mountains and silence and a man who'd risked everything for a stranger. The last page made Silas's hands shake. "I don't know if I can be the woman you need," she wrote. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for mountain winters or brave enough to leave civilization behind. But I know that when I close my eyes, I see your cabin. I see us sitting by the fire, and it feels more like home than any place I've ever lived. So I'm coming back. Not right away. The trial is in September, and I have to be there. But after that, if you'll still have me, I'd like to try. I'd like to see if a city woman and a mountain man can build something real. What do you say, Silas Boone? Is the door still open?" Silas read the letter 3 times, just to be sure he hadn't imagined it. Then he looked up at Porter, who was watching him with barely concealed amusement. "Good news?" the engineer asked. "Yeah," Silas said, and couldn't stop the grin spreading across his face. "Yeah, it is." He spent the summer finishing the new room and preparing for Evelyn's arrival. He built a proper bed frame, his current one was just a wooden platform, and hung curtains in the windows to replace the old hides. He stocked up on supplies, traded for fabric and thread, and the kinds of things a woman might want. Thomas Greer helped, riding up to the cabin every few weeks with materials and advice. The blacksmith had rebuilt his forge with money donated by grateful townspeople, and business was better than ever. He seemed to take genuine pleasure in helping Silas prepare for Evelyn's return. "Never thought I'd see the day," Greer said one afternoon as they worked on installing a new stove. "Silas Boone, building a home for a woman. Don't get too excited. She might change her mind." "She won't." "How do you know?" Greer straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Because I've seen the way she looked at you, same way Sarah used to look at you back in the day, like you hung the moon." The mention of Sarah's name still carried weight, but it didn't hurt the way it once had. Silas had loved Sarah with everything he had, but she was gone, and holding on to that grief forever wouldn't honor her memory. It would just waste the life she'd wanted him to live. "Sarah would have liked her," Silas said quietly. "Yeah," Greer agreed. "I think she would have." The letter announcing Evelyn's arrival came in early October. The trial was over. Ashford had been convicted on multiple charges and sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. His assets had been seized, his reputation destroyed. Justice, imperfect but real, had been served. "I'll be on the westbound stage arriving October 18th, Evelyn wrote. "If you've changed your mind, I understand. But if you haven't, I'll be the woman with too many bags and not enough sense, stepping off the stage and hoping like hell that mountain life is everything I've been dreaming about." October 18th dawned clear and cold, with frost on the ground and the smell of snow in the air. Silas rode down to Iron Hollow before dawn, his heart hammering in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. What if she didn't come? What if she took one look at the mountains and realized she'd made a terrible mistake? But when the stage rolled in at noon, Evelyn Harrow stepped out, and all Silas's fears evaporated. She looked different, stronger somehow, with a confidence that hadn't been there before. She wore practical clothes, warm and sturdy, and her hair was pulled back in a simple braid. When she saw him, her face lit up with a smile that could have melted the frost. "Hello, Silas," she said. "Hello, Evelyn." They stood there for a moment, just looking at each other. Then she laughed, ran to him, and he caught her up in his arms, holding her tight. "I can't believe you came back," he said into her hair. "I can't believe you doubted I would." "Are you sure about this? Mountain winters are hard. The cabin's isolated. You'll be giving up." She pulled back and put her finger over his lips. "I'm giving up nothing I want to keep, and I'm gaining everything that matters. So yes, Silas Boone. I'm sure." They rode up to the cabin together that afternoon, Evelyn's bags tied to Flint's saddle. As they climbed into the high country, she kept turning back to look at the view, the mountains rolling away to the horizon, the valleys painted in autumn gold, the sky so blue it hurt to look at. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "Wait until you've been through a winter. You might change your mind." "I won't." And looking at her, at the fierce joy on her face, the way she sat the horse like she belonged there, Silas believed her. That night, they sat by the fire in the cabin, wrapped in blankets, drinking coffee and talking about everything and nothing. About Evelyn's testimony at the trial and how good it had felt to watch Ashford's face when the guilty verdict was read. About Silas's summer building the new room and how he'd nearly put the window in backwards. About their plans for the winter and what they'd do when spring came. "I want to help people," Evelyn said. "Women in situations like mine. Women trapped by debt or bad marriages or men who think they own them. We could use this cabin as a way station, a place where they can rest and figure out their next move." "That's dangerous," Silas said. "Men like Ashford don't like it when their property runs away." "I know, but that's why they need people like us, people who aren't afraid to fight back." Silas considered this. It would mean giving up his solitude, opening his home to strangers, risking the peaceful life he'd built. But looking at Evelyn's face, seeing the passion there, he realized something. Peace wasn't the same as happiness. And maybe, just maybe, fighting for something bigger than himself was exactly what he'd been missing all these years. "All right," he said. "We'll do it." Evelyn's smile could have lit the whole cabin. "Really?" "Really, but we do it smart. We set up escape routes, hide supplies, make sure we're never trapped, and we don't take on fights we can't win." Agreed. They sealed the deal with a kiss that turned into more, and that night, for the first time in 15 years, Silas Boone didn't sleep alone. The years that followed weren't easy. Mountain life was exactly as hard as Silas had warned, and there were days when Evelyn wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. But there were more days, far more, when she woke up beside Silas, looked out at the mountains turning gold in the sunrise, and felt a bone-deep satisfaction that she'd finally found where she belonged. They did help people, just as Evelyn had wanted. Word spread quietly through the network of desperate women that there was a cabin in the high country where you could hide, where a fierce woman and a silent mountain man would protect you while you figured out your next move. They didn't save everyone. Some women couldn't make the journey. Others were found before they could run. But the ones who did make it to the cabin found safety. And sometimes, with Silas and Evelyn's help, they found justice too. Thomas Greer became their connection to the outside world, passing messages and supplies up to the cabin, helping organize safe transport for women who needed to leave the territory entirely. Porter and his crew on the railroad did the same, smuggling women out in freight cars and cabooses, asking no questions. It was dangerous work. More than once, angry husbands or debt collectors came looking for their missing property. But they found that getting to the cabin meant going through Silas Boone, and after the first few attempts ended with the seekers being sent back down the mountain bruised and empty-handed, most gave up. 5 years after Evelyn first arrived at the cabin, she stood in the doorway watching Silas teach a young woman how to shoot. The woman's name was Margaret, and she'd fled from a mining camp where her husband had beaten her within an inch of her life. She'd been at the cabin for 2 weeks, healing and learning and slowly rediscovering the person she'd been before fear had consumed her. "Keep your arms steady," Silas was saying, his voice patient. "Breathe out slow, then squeeze." The rifle cracked. The tin can on the fence post jumped and fell. Margaret lowered the rifle, her eyes wide. "I did it." "You did," Silas agreed. "Now do it again." Evelyn smiled, resting her hand on her swollen belly. The baby was due in 3 months. A daughter, the midwife said, though Evelyn would love her regardless of what the midwife predicted. She and Silas had talked about names, and they'd settled on Sarah, a way of honoring the past while building toward the future. As she watched her husband teach another wounded soul how to fight back, Evelyn thought about the journey that had brought her here. The fear and the running, the frozen nights and desperate choices, the train chase and the burning building and the moment when everything could have ended. And she thought about the man who'd ridden into a blizzard to save a stranger, who'd risked everything for someone he barely knew, who'd given her a second chance at life. She'd come to the mountains running from a monster and found a home with a man who'd shown her what true strength looked like. Not the power to control others, but the courage to stand up for what was right, even when it cost you everything. That night, after Margaret had gone to bed in the guest room and the cabin was quiet, Silas found Evelyn sitting by the fire, her hands resting on her belly. "You all right?" he asked. "Better than all right," she said. "I was just thinking about how far we've come. We've got a ways to go yet." "I know, but Silas?" She took his hand. "I wouldn't change a single step of the journey." He sat beside her, pulled her close, and together they watched the fire burn low. While outside, the mountain wind sang through the pines and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient dance. They had found their place in the world, these two survivors. A mountain man who'd learned to love again, and a city woman who'd discovered she was stronger than she'd ever imagined. They had built something real from the ashes of their broken pasts, a home, a purpose, a love that had been forged in fire and ice and the desperate fight to survive. And in the high country of Wyoming, in a cabin that stood as both sanctuary and fortress, they lived out the life that Marcus Ashford and men like him had tried to deny them. They lived free. They lived fierce. And most importantly, they lived together, proving every single day that sometimes the best revenge against those who try to destroy you is simply refusing to be destroyed. The mountains held them safe. The years rolled on, and the legend grew of the cabin in the high country where broken people could go to become whole again, protected by a woman with a will of iron and a man with a heart that had learned, finally, to trust in tomorrow.